Welcome to Cinema of Meaning, the podcast that seeks to explore the depths of what cinema has to offer. My name is Tom, you may know me as the creator of Like Stories of Old, and I'm joined by fellow video essayist Thomas Flight to talk about what, according to the new Sight and Sound poll, is the best movie of all time. And that is Chantal Akerman's Jeanne Dielman, 23, Quai du Commerce, 1080, Bruxelles. So that's quite a mouthful.
It is a mouthful. You can, if you're listening to this and you're wondering, if you just Google Jeanne Dielman, you'll find it, and that's probably what we'll call the movie throughout.
Jeanne Dielman, yeah.
Yes,
it's basically just the full address where the movie takes place, mostly. Yes. Yeah, but before we get into it, a quick thank you to all of our patrons who have been supporting the show. If you also want to support these discussions and become part of our private Discord community, where you can learn more about upcoming episodes, offer suggestions, and talk about films with us and other patrons, feel free to check out our page at patreon.com/cinema of meaning or just follow the link in the show notes. Jeanne Dielman, this kind of surprisingly took the number one spot at the Sight and Sound critics list, or the best movies of all time according to this great selection of critics. It's one of the most renowned lists, so to say.
Yeah, it's updated every decade. And it got an update this year. Vertigo, I think, was the film that had been at the top of the list previously. Mm-hmm. The way it works, by the way, is they poll over, I think it's like 1,600 critics or something like that. Each critic gives their top 10 films, and then they make a rank based off of that. And this year, Jeanne Dielman moved from spot number 23 all the way up to number 1, and generated a lot of discourse online because, I think this was unexpected by a lot of people. I think it kind of makes sense. A lot of people are talking about, this being one of the most renowned films from a female director, and there's a movement towards appreciating and acknowledging more work by women that's been done throughout film history. And so I think this is because there's statistically less of that kind of work.
Yeah.
The significant ones tend to really rise to the top because people are selecting these specifically. There's less to choose from. So we thought it would be interesting to talk about.
Yeah. Because we both hadn't seen it, right?
Yes, we both hadn't seen it. I've been aware of it for a long time. It had kind of been on my list. It's one of those movies you sort of hear a legend of. It's about this woman peeling potatoes or something. You're always kind of like, I should watch that. But also it's like 3 hours and 20 minutes long or something like that. It's a little bit of an intimidating undertaking.
So yeah, for me, I actually hadn't heard of it before, which is kind of rare for me because, I don't know every movie, but I do consider myself to be enough of a cinephile that I would at least have heard of it. Because from that Sight and Sound poll, I'd seen, I think, like 80 of the 100 movies.
That's and of the 20
I hadn't seen, I think I'd heard of most of them. So it's kind of a funny coincidence that it happens to be the exact number one spot this year that also happened to be my blind spot with regards to movies. But I was actually kind of excited to check it out just because it was so new, and at least for me, and because it did generate a lot of controversy. At first I had the same reluctance, like, oh, what's this film that I don't know that suddenly is the best movie of all time? But it's one of those things that people tend to get hung up on too much, in my opinion. Obviously there's no one greatest movie of all time, and as you said, it's probably a bit of a mathematical anomaly that kind of pushed this movie all the way to the top, because as you said, like, if you only have 10 movies to select from, there's histories filled with male directors for, historical reasons. There were historically less female directors and just less great movies by female directors. And so when there is that push or incentive to kind of broaden your horizon and explore more diverse movies, it's logical that if you have like 1,000 people pick a movie from that smaller pool of movies, then it's gonna skew the results a little bit. In this case, in Jeanne Dielman's favor. But just let's talk about the movie in its own right.
Well, I want to say, before we move on from the list, I just wanted to say, having watched it now, it's not my number one favorite movie of all time, but neither was Vertigo, the previous one at the top. So I don't take these lists that seriously. But I will say, having said that, I think it definitely deserves to be high on this list. Like, I think it's a really well-made, great film that I really enjoyed, and we'll get into that. So I don't want to insinuate by saying what we just said that it doesn't deserve a high ranking on this list. I think it is a great film that deserves to be high up on this thing. It just, people tend to like get way too caught up and heated about these discussions about where things are on the list. So we want to move on from that. That's not the point of this podcast, and actually just talk about what is, I think, a really interesting movie here. So,
And that list, it didn't even have any Terrence Malick, so...
Right.
Anyway. Talking about the movie in its own right, I think I actually was surprised at how much I enjoyed it, and it definitely, I agree, it definitely deserves a place among the greats. I think, there's kind of two ways to approach a movie like this from. There's the kind of the place or just the immediate experience. If you put it on now and you have just sort of you kind of experience it as it is in a sort of vacuum between the movie and yourself.
Right.
And then there's the consideration of what the movie or the context in which the movie came out and what it meant for the time in which it came out and what it meant for film history, which is something I always struggle to balance. There's a lot of movies that I recognize as being very influential and impactful, but which I don't necessarily consider personal favorites of mine, that or in the sense that I don't have a strong personal attachment to them. So that's why I'm glad I wasn't asked for 10 movies to put on the list. But I tried it, but it's
very hard.
Really hard, yeah.
Yeah.
The thing for me was there's like 5 movies that I'd put on there, but then there's the other 5. I don't know. There's so many. You could ask me any day of the week, and I'd probably have a few other ones that resonated with me a little bit more, or that I'd considered a little bit more highly. Again, it's lists like these are always kind of fickle and take them with a grain of salt, but at least I'm thankful for that. Because I wouldn't have watched this film probably anytime soon, at least, if it wasn't on the number 1 spot this year. So in that sense, I am happy that it took the number 1 place, because I am glad that I watched it, especially after watching a lot of Bellatar stuff.
Yes, I thought about that.
Like, I was mentally prepared for long movies with lots of potatoes. And lots of daily routines. And it's actually, if you compare it to like, Satan Tango obviously beats it with regards to length. That's Bellatar's longest movie at 7.5 hours or something like that. So I would actually compare it more closely to The Turin Horse, which also has this structure where you see day in, day out, the kind of monotonous routine of these characters who go about their day. They do their work. They also eat potatoes. And then at the end, it just kind of fizzles out. But that to me was my initial point of reference when I was watching this. Both for better and for worse, I think. I liked what I liked initially about Jeanne Dielman, the immediate impression, is that it's so static and voyeuristic. It actually, I thought of these, you have these wildlife cameras that kind of, you have these movement sensors and they start recording when someone enters or some animal enters the space of the camera within the frame, basically. And it kind of felt like this was something similar, where in each room of the apartment there were these cameras, and they would only be triggered as soon as Jeanne entered into the room.
Right.
That kind of voyeuristic feeling to it, which I thought was really interesting, which is wildly different from, let's say, The Turin Horse, which is very much more stylized. It's black and white. It's more artsy, more poetic. There's more music and there's just more meta level stylization going on, whereas this feels more like a much more straightforward slice of life. And there's just something hypnotic about it. I don't know about you, but every time I start a new movie, I have that initial sort of judgment-free zone where I'm just curious to see, okay, what is this? And then at some point I usually I kind of snap out of it, and you kind of become more self-aware again. And for me, that with Jeanne Dielman, that didn't happen until like 40 minutes into the movie, where I was like, oh, how far into this am I? And I
Right,
checked
right.
the runtime, and I was already 40 minutes in. So it's like half a normal feature length movie had already
Yeah.
passed before I even kind of started questioning like what's going on, which may sound detrimental, but it's actually, I saw it actually as a positive, that it kind of hooked me, and it grabbed my attention for quite a stretch before I even started kind of snapping back into that more analytical mode again.
Yes. I also found it very easy to kind of slip into the film. And it almost
Hmm.
like, I was very surprised by that. It didn't feel as long as it is to me, or I don't know. I didn't feel that running time. And I think
Yeah.
because it kind of lulls you into this sort of meditative state. You're not expecting a bunch of stuff to happen. And then, I don't know. Yeah, I just found it very interesting in that regard. It held my attention, I think, more than I was expecting that it might.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I've seen 2 hour movies that,
Dragged a lot more than this. Yeah.
yeah, it's interesting. It reminded me also a little bit of the discussion we had on unconventional documentaries and the
Yes.
way in which you can have these very experimental, very slow moving movies that they can be like slow and you can feel the length and you can even be sort of bored by it. But I'm not bored during these movies in the way that I'm bored during a more conventional narrative film. Like for me, like a movie like, let's say Black Adam or something, to name a recent example, that to me was a movie where like 20 minutes in, I was already kind of
Right.
dreading it and kind of done with it. And
Yeah.
it was starting to become a bit of a drag, whereas with Jean Dielman, that didn't happen until much later. There were certain stretches where some shots just went on, and I kind of started to unconsciously move my hand towards the fast forward button.
Right.
But yeah, overall, I think it was a surprisingly easy movie to get through. And I think above all, it was one that just left me wanting more, or that left me wanting to dive into what it all meant and what it signifies. And it's really one that challenged me in a way that I've only come to appreciate more over the last few years, where I've seen more movies, and maybe I'm just looking for more examples to kind of push the boundaries and challenge me in ways that
Right.
I haven't been before. Because
Yeah.
there's so many movies now that are good, but they're not necessarily challenging, or they're not necessarily surprising you.
Yeah.
It's a really random example, but I had a moment where I thought of The Sound of Metal, which at
Hmm.
the time I remember watching that and thinking, oh, this is a really good movie. But at the same time, it was also a movie where I felt like it was almost reverse engineered from video essays. Like I could see the exact structure and the skeleton beneath it as I was watching it. Like, oh, this is the character. Here we set up his problem. Here we set up the thing he needs at the end. And this is where we set up the event that's going to set out his journey. And it was all executed very well. And I think that movie has a lot of things going for it, especially with the way it gives us insight into the deaf community. But as the sort of narrative structure of it at no point truly surprised me. Not at
Yeah.
least in a way that this movie did. And that's something that I've really come to appreciate, and I'm just really fascinated by.
Right. This is a movie that has also been sitting with me a lot since I watched it.
Mm.
There's a lot more there than what maybe immediately meets the eye. I think it's interesting to read about this movie or hear the little snippets that you heard about it, which I was surprised that that I hadn't encountered what I would consider to be the spoilers for this movie. So I went in like entirely
Same.
blind, not knowing where this was going. I think that's maybe one of the surprises, is that it does actually go somewhere kind of eventually, or there is stuff happening in this movie more so than you would maybe think based on some of the descriptions that you would read.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you'll see snippets from people who describe the movie or something like that, and they're like, oh, we just watched this woman peel potatoes for 10 minutes or something, which I think is an exaggeration. I don't know that scene is actually actually that long.
It's not that long, no.
It's not that long.
It does feel long.
When you watch that scene, by the time we got to that scene, to me, there was so much going on in that scene, or so much that I wanted to understand. Like the performance is really, there's layers to, she's like thinking through something, or you want to really know what she's thinking about. You're not just watching her peel potatoes. The way she's peeling potatoes becomes interesting because you've been sitting inside this woman's life for like an hour and a half at this point, and the minutia of how she's doing things kind of starts to take on this significance. The first thing, I kind of want to mention is, I think the most obvious top layer of this movie for me is just the basic dynamic from, I guess, kind of a more feminist perspective or reading that I think is part of why it is immediately significant, is just the basic element of, we're taking these kind of domestic tasks that would normally not only get ignored by cinema, but like that get ignored by society on or like the patriarchy on a large scale. There's a very basic element of, Chantal Akerman, the director, being like, I'm going to make a 3-hour movie that's primarily about the like washing dishes and making the food and trying to find a button for my son's coat and all these things, and kind of elevating that to those tasks we overlook to the same level of significance as like Vito Corleone being like, you come to my, it's like there's kind of a basic presupposition that is almost posed by this movie, which is like, why don't we treat this kind of life with the same dramatic import that we do, like, any of the many things that we've given 3 hours to in cinema. And so I think that's fascinating on a basic level. And it's really hard, I think, to watch this and not think about, like, think about your mother or women in your life who may have done domestic work for you as a child, or, still might in your life. It forces you to like really connect with those basic tasks on kind of an intimate level. And so I found that very interesting, but I don't think that's where the movie like ends. That's kind of the starting place. And then there's the most interesting stuff to me anyway, was sort of like what it's doing beyond that basic groundwork.
I agree. I actually like the way Akerman herself put it in an interview, where she said that she wanted to give the undervalued a life on film, which I thought was a nice way of putting it, because you're right. I had the same feeling where I was thinking to myself at one point, why is it, if we portray ordinary life on film, why is that considered so radical? It's kind of strange when you think about it, that just the straightforward depiction of everyday life is such a taboo almost, in a way, or it's just something that's so noteworthy, and for some people like so frustrating even. But I was thinking, have we even given a basic plot overview of what this movie is about for those who may not have seen it yet?
No, we haven't.
So, okay, real short, you can probably already sort of put it together maybe, but it's basically a story about a woman. She's a single mother. Her husband died a couple of years ago, who lives in this apartment, and we basically see 3 days in her life. She lives this very methodical, very routine-based existence, basically. On the surface level, she also prostitutes herself to men every day. There's like someone coming over in the afternoon, which is probably where it's all kind of implied, but that's where she likely gets her money. But other than that,
we just see them come in and go into the room and then come out later and get her money. So
that's to the point what we were talking about earlier. The movie tends to cut around like all the stuff that you would normally center in a movie.
Right.
It kind of feels like if you have a piece of paper and you cut out the figure that you want, and then instead of displaying that figure, you instead show the part that you left out. The cutoffs and stuff, that's the part that becomes highlighted. Like, let's say there's I think on the first day you see her, the camera's standing in the hallway, and you see her with this man go into the bathroom, and then the shot remains the same, but it cuts to later in the day, and they come back out of the room again. And so it's basically just a blink of an eye in which that whole act is basically over, and then it moves on again. So we only see like everything around it. We see her clean up afterwards and all that sort of stuff. But that's also, I think, a big part of what the movie is about thematically and what it says about her character. You mentioned the potato peeling scene and trying to figure out what's going on, because it does feel like there was a sense of frustration in her in that act of her doing that. But I felt like a lot of the difficulty for reading her character comes because you only have these static shots that it's literally like a fly on the wall observing. There's no cutting, there's no compositions really going on, or dramatic compositions where you suddenly have like a close-up to emphasize something. It kind of remains this neutral observer where you really feel like the outsider who is trying to get a sense of the interiority of this woman.
Yeah.
But you do get like a lot of hints, and the way the movie constructed in a way also reflects, I think, a lot about her character. Especially like there's something that happens, I think, on the second day that kind of upsets her in a way. I'm not sure if you want to get into spoilers yet, or...
I think we can. We can start moving into kind of what I see as the plot, quote unquote, of this movie. We maybe won't talk about the very end yet, but you kind of establish her routines in like the first day and a half. And we see her, she cooks, she does sex work in the afternoon. She cooks dinner for her son. They eat dinner together. Their relationship is kind of weird and strained. Like, he doesn't really talk to her about things. She'll ask him questions and he just won't answer at all. But we're methodically shown like all the details of her, them unfolding the bed, and they go on a walk before, and they listen to the radio at a certain time, and she knits for a little bit. There's all these things, and you very much get the sense that like they do it this way every night, and this is the rhythm. This is the way things are done. I mean, you get that sense is already baked into things the first time you're seeing them. You just get like, one of the things that I found really interesting the first time through was her reading the newspaper. She like picks up this newspaper and she just like looks at every page and never actually reads any of it, and then just folds it over and like puts it away. And you very much get the sense that, I don't know if that, I was trying to figure out if the movie was actually trying to stylize the progression of time in some places where things were supposed to be longer than really what you're actually seeing, because it's all one take. It's just kind of like there's a suggestion that they're sitting there and she's knitting for like 30 minutes, but you only see like 4 minutes of it. Or if you're actually supposed to be seeing things kind of in real time, at least within an individual shot. I don't know. I couldn't really figure that out by the end. I think it's interesting either way, but in how those actions take place, you get the sense of like, she's just doing it because this is the next thing you do, and this is how you do the next thing. And these are the rituals that I've set out in my life. But then you also actually see them repeat the next day, and you're like, okay, this is the way she does things, and these are the steps, and this is the routine. But then, to get to what you mentioned, it kind of starts to break apart a little bit in these, at first, subtle ways.
At first, you don't know why, really, until it's only towards the end that you can kind of look back in hindsight and maybe figure like, oh,
piece it together.
That might have been it. Yeah.
Yeah. Where do you think, I mean, maybe we can't talk about this without talking about the end, and maybe we should get to that. But
there's some stuff I can say before we get into the actual ending. What I was going to say about the way the movie, even though you do not directly get insight into her character, the movie is still constructed in such a way that you do kind of get a sense of what her life is like, beyond the literal day-to-day stuff that she gets up to. What Akerman really conveys really well is that this is a woman who basically has no time to herself, and in a way also doesn't want it, in the sense that she has these meticulous routines and they kind of keep her occupied, and it's only when the routine kind of breaks, that also the anxiety of her, all of her like accumulated frustrations and sorrows and whatnot, that's when that creeps in. There's this moment, I think it was on the second day, that her son has to get up early for something. He has to leave for, I don't remember exactly what it was he was doing, but I think the point of that whole thing is that Jeanne is also up earlier than she would normally do. And so she kind of starts her day earlier, but that means that towards the end, she has time left. There's there's that moment where she sits in the chair for what feels also like 10 minutes, and she just kind of stares blankly in front of her.
Yeah.
And that to me was that moment where she'd kind of done all her tasks. She'd completed her routine, but it was a little bit out of sync with her usual routine. And so there was this space for contemplation and reflection to set in. And that's also when let's call it the darkness kind of crept in for her. And that to me, that was just such a poignant way of communicating the not just, it's obviously the life of a woman in this kind of patriarchal oppression, but also I think there's a more universally appealing message there for everyone who feels constrained in a certain like routine, and in the way, and that experience that once a routine breaks, there's an anxiety that can set in, and that can really trigger, evaluations about your life, both for better and for worse. And I think that's something that this movie captured really well, and really in a really subtle way, that which I really liked. So that's one thing I wanted to add before we get into the spoilers about the way this movie kind of constructs a character by showing the sort of externalities of her life, which nevertheless give us insight into what goes on the inside.
Yeah, there's a lot of little clues we get, and there's moments like where she meets a friend while she's out, and the friend's like, hey, come over for coffee, and she's kind of like, no, I'm too busy or something, I think. Mm-hmm. And then it's like we see the rest of her day. She doesn't seem that busy. Like she probably could have squeezed the coffee, and maybe, she also has a lot. She does have a lot that she's doing, but
I wasn't always sure, like, is this something that she actually absolutely had to do, or if it was just also a kind of neuroticism where she kind of takes out every little statue from this cabinet to kind of dust it off. I guess, to some extent, these are all tasks that have to be done, but there's a kind of a fine line where is this a task that I have to do, or am I just kind of looking for stuff to do now to keep that previously mentioned anxiety at bay?
At bay, yeah.
But at the same time, I do think a large part of her routine is always focused towards someone else. She rarely does something purely for herself. Yeah. She's either busy with her clients or doing stuff for her son. There's these moments where that you mentioned, the moment where she's knitting and she's listening to the radio, and you think, oh, maybe that's where she's practicing like a hobby, taking a moment to relax. But then it's revealed, the son comes in and she kind of measures his size, and you get the sense like, oh, she's making that for him, and she's polishing his shoes at one point. And on the first day, there's an early scene where she takes a bath after seeing her client, and instead of kind of filling up the bathtub and relaxing and taking that nice bath, she just is kind of sitting hunched over, mechanically washing herself. It just never feels like she does something that's purely for herself. And I think that's where the ending also comes into play.
Right.
And which may also be like the event that happens on the second day. You want to get into it, or do you want to?
I think we can start getting into the ending and just go from there.
In one of the final scenes, we actually go into the bedroom with her client, and we see her having sex, even though at first it kind of seems like she's laying on her back, the guy's on top of her, and it kind of seems like he's just sleeping or something. Like it feels
he's very still.
Very still. It feels very unsensual and anything but like erotic or sexy, It just feels very mechanical. But what happens to Jeanne is that she actually has an orgasm. I think it's likely that that's also something that happened on the second day, where I'm not sure, because that's wherein...
Oh, right. We don't see.
It's not shown, but she does feel like she comes out of that second day encounter kind of flustered compared to the first.
Right.
Because on the first day, before she sees her client, she sets the potatoes on the on the stove, and when she knows exactly how long things take, and so
Yeah.
she's done with her client, and that's exactly enough time for the potatoes to boil.
Right.
But then on the second day, her hair's messed up, the potatoes are overcooked, and there's clearly something that happened in the bedroom that she wasn't expecting, because that's
Yeah.
another thing too. On the first day,
Yeah.
they go into the bedroom and they come out of it seconds later, or at least to us seconds later, and they are looking like perfectly neat, like as if nothing happened.
The second day, her hair is messed up too on the second
Yeah,
day, which
exactly.
is not on the first. Yeah.
Yeah, her son makes a mention of that. So
Yeah.
there's something that happened on the second day that surprised her and that kind of
Right.
disrupted her flow. And I think on the third day, I think at least it is revealed that she experienced an orgasm, or perhaps even the first one she ever had. At least I think I read that somewhere that might have been the case.
That is, I want to say that's the accepted interpretation, and I'm not arguing with that. The director has said that portrayal is the intent, but I think there's also some kind of ambiguity in that moment. I watched this with.
You mean towards the end, or what happened on the second day?
No, that last scene where they have sex at the end. Yeah, both my wife and I, when we watched this, like read that scene more as like a rape, because she at first is
Really?
resisting him and kind of like pushing against him.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't see it again. If you haven't seen it, which people watching this hopefully have, but you have very little details. It's a static shot from above. You can't really see the man's kind of blocking the way. We see her face a little bit and kind of, but there's not a lot of detail there.
Yeah.
You can read the enjoyment that she has on her face, but there's clear like conflict about that. Whatever it is, it's more conflicted for her character, which obviously we'll get into. Obviously, you're saying, and I like that idea. I hadn't encountered that or thought of that or seen it in anything that I read. That's what happens on the second day. She gets thrown off, and it's like this disruptive thing to her whole like concept. But then I guess big spoilers.
Yeah.
She stabs the guy at the end with the scissors. There's this very ambiguous like conflict, at least within herself, as to how she's dealing with this or processing it, or there's something about this that destructive to the worldview that she's had, or the framework that she's been trying to like view the world through.
Yeah, I think one important element there is that is the way she talks about her marriage, and about her, specifically also about her sexual past and her kind of sexual relation to her former or late husband.
Yeah.
Where she talked about wanting to be a wife and having a child. Or no, she said she wanted a life of her own and wanted to have a child. That's what she said. And I felt like she's really of the generation where marriage was still more of a, not necessarily a romantic endeavor, but more of a, this is just a thing you do kind of thing. I actually see it like with, the grandparents that I've known. It's very different from like my parents or other people I know that are at my parents' age. But yes, she basically said that her marriage to her son's father, or her late husband, was pretty much loveless, and she kind of saw sex as this little detail that's just necessary to get the child into the world, which I think also comes back in the way she treats her clients, or the way the movie treats her clients, in the way that it to her it's nothing, and for us as the viewer, it therefore also isn't nothing. It's just one of the tasks that gets checked off, aside from peeling the potatoes and cleaning the bathtub and whatnot. So there's a very passionless relation for her to sexuality.
Yeah.
And so I think in that sense, it's interesting what if someone like that would experience an orgasm for the first time in her life, like that, it obviously would mean a lot to her own relation to her own sexuality, and maybe the concept of sex in general, but also maybe more generally as we talked about her basically having no life of her own, and basically just doing these routines and living in service of someone else, and really now having this experience that's purely for her pleasure or for her enjoyment, because the guy, he kind of, at the end, he's just laying there, it looks like he's doing nothing, which for me is why it didn't really, I didn't really read it as a rape scene in the sense,
Right.
she was kind of moving, but not in a way, she was not, it didn't feel like she was genuinely like pushing him off, because it felt like he was just such a,
inert.
kind of a, he was just, she could have, if she wanted him off, he would have gone off. It seemed like he was just kind of, at first I genuinely thought he was maybe, it was already over and they were sleeping. There was, he wasn't moving, he wasn't doing anything. It didn't feel like he was threatening in any, her in any real way. So that to me is what kind of, that's why I read that moment as her kind of finally claiming something that's truly hers and that's truly something ecstatic in her life of otherwise just dull, passionless routine, and maybe not knowing how to handle it. I think the director said that the whole prostitute aspect of the movie and the murder at the end is pretty much just metaphor. Although I'm not 100% sure like what especially the murder at the end, what that would signify. That there's a superficial reading of that scene where it felt like it kind of went from being this heroification of the everyday woman to a more direct assault on men, which is something that if you assume that reading, then I wouldn't like that ending as much. It feels like then it would end on a more cynical note.
Right.
But more, if you read into it more metaphorically, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I read the ending as a victory for her character or as a tragedy. That's kind of what I'm struggling with at this point. But.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know how to read that ending either. I don't take it as, well, I guess, I mean, the fact that interpreted it as a rape, which is not exclusive to me. I read some other takes from people who also had that feeling. Although, I think the generally broadly accepted interpretation is that it wasn't. I'm not really arguing that for being the correct interpretation. It just colored my view of how it ended. And so, that affected my perception, caveat aside. But when you see it that way, I don't know, it doesn't make it more of a triumph. But if you understand why she stabs him a little bit more, or it seems a little more evident on the face of it, and then you're left at the end with this kind of oh no, what is she going to do? How is she going to deal with this situation? But the more I've thought about it since then, and after reading more about it, I don't know how exactly to interpret the metaphor without, I think, watching it again and sitting with it for a little bit longer. But I like the metaphorical view a little bit more in relationship to the story as a whole, because I think ultimately, to me, if you're dealing with it in a very literal sense of oh, now she's killed this guy, you have to answer these questions of what are the effects and consequences of that going to be? Was that morally justified to do? All of these things, which I think muddy the water of kind of what is really the most interesting bit about this movie, which is, in a more metaphorical view, you can take her own psychological relationship to maybe men, her clients, her own pleasure, all these things. After watching maybe all of that behind her eyes for 3 hours, we're seeing this sudden outburst of those things being revealed on some level in the physical world that we're seeing in the film, and just the complexity and sort of turmoil that's there. I don't know if there's a really specific statement that's being made, clients are exploitative of sex workers, and so killing one is a victory for this woman. I don't think it's that. I don't think that kind of reading is what's going on here.
I think if you go into that direction, would have to have more clues along the way that she was in fact being exploited, whereas the way it's portrayed now literally is that these men are all seem very polite, and they come with her, they pay her. There doesn't seem to be any struggle until it kind of comes out of the blue that she stabs this guy. So I think my triumphant interpretation of the plot would be that she to put it simply, she just basically kills the part of herself that kept her trapped in that sort of passionless, dreadful routine. And so she chooses, I'm going to break free.
Right, right.
So she's more killing a part of herself than literally killing this man.
Yeah.
And then she kind of sits with the consequences because, a sudden freedom is, there's an ecstasy to it, but there's also then immediately that moment where if there's no longer any routine to define her, so she just sits there kind of motionless, pensive, not knowing what to do. And that's also, I think, the kind of the flip side of freedom, that it's now up to her to decide what the rest of her life's going to be like. And that's exciting as well as scary. And that has its own weight, as we have talked about in other movies where, especially more recent movies where we've talked about like the internet, which it's kind of given us an overabundance of freedom in a way.
Right.
But yeah, this movie is kind of set in a different social context. I think still this was the 75, that's the sort of second wave of feminism, where, you had the first wave that kind of challenged more directly the legal side of equality, voting rights, ownership, that sort of stuff. The second wave of feminism was more about the cultural aspect and the kind of the role that women and men are supposed to have in a household, and kind of challenging that or putting it to the test. And I feel like, that's something that this movie obviously fits more into. Yeah, whereas, we're now in the fourth wave of feminism. So there's been some progression since then. And, I'm not sure to what extent it's worth discussing how relevant this movie still is in that sense. But I think for that movie in that time, I think there was a lot of significance to her kind of breaking free from her domestic life and breaking free from those routines and taking some ownership and having some claim to her own desires and needs in a way that she wasn't able to satisfy before, when she was just stuck in these routines, taking care of everyone else. So yeah, that's kind of that was my initial reading of the ending. Sort of triumphant, but with the caveat that now, there's the kind of dread of freedom that's looming over the horizon. At least, I'm not sure if that's one that I'm going to stick with if I ever rewatch it and have more time to sit with it. But yeah. I do like that more than a literal interpretation where she kills someone and now is probably going to face a lot of negative consequences for it, she has to clean it up or has to go to jail or whatever.
Yeah, I also prefer the metaphorical reading, although I think within even a metaphorical context, my read is slightly bleaker, where I'm not necessarily sure she's killing the thing that was keeping her in sort of the domestic routine. It's not exactly evident to me that is what she's killing. It might be, I think, potentially more a reaction against her own reaction against feeling herself breaking this thing that is trying to break her out of that. So she feels the sort of door open up to this wider world of possibility that exists outside of the routine, and she immediately
slams it shut.
She immediately slams the door shut. And the reason I read it that way, I think, is because I feel like we see her doing this in the movie. There's almost like a pattern of that kind of thing that gets set up. There's that scene where the first time she goes to get coffee, and she sits down and she puts her sugar cubes in, and then she stares off into the distance for a moment. There's a great piece of performance where you almost feel like she's daydreaming or she's thinking about something maybe even a little bit pleasant, and then she really collects herself and pulls herself together, and it's almost like you kind of see on her face this no, we don't have time for that, and then she gets up and leaves. And then as the movie is progressing, as things start to fall apart, it feels like something's happening. Her routine is disrupted, and she's trying all these different things she's trying all these different routines or activities to kind of keep it held down in place, and not to think about it, not to allow the consideration or contemplation of her situation or, this thing that she's dealing with to grow and expand. And so we get all these scenes where she's like trying to make the coffee and, it's not right. So she keeps adjusting. It's like all these elements of control coming down to a moment you already mentioned where she's like sitting there and then she goes and polishes and I almost like that made me think of almost like Walter White in Breaking Bad or something, where there's that famous Fly episode where he's like, I need to kill very different characters, but like this thought crosses my mind of like that thing, polishing the figurines is not going to solve the thing that you're being confronted with right now. It's an attempt to like get a handle on this thing that is too like large, almost too scary in its implications to really like fully consider almost. And the ending is like a kind of putting that to death and like, maybe keeping a lid on things. I could be wrong about that. That's just like, that's one feeling I got too.
I think that's a solid interpretation too. I can definitely see that. And I agree that she definitely comes across as the person who finds safety and comfort in the routines and kind of uses them as a means to not have to deal with everything else.
Right.
We haven't really talked about that, but there might be like lingering trauma for maybe her grief for her husband, or I think it was mentioned somewhere that the movie in some way deals with war trauma as well.
I'm not sure how explicit it is in the movie. If it is, it's like in little clues that I didn't pick up on, but the literal context is that a lot of it is kind of a semi-biographical ode to Akerman's mother who survived Auschwitz. I think like that implication is there subtextually, probably through how Akerman is like portraying this character.
As in that that the main character would also have been during the war in...
No, I don't know that is.
I think she was 75. She met her husband after the war, so I'm just trying to calculate what age she would have been. I felt like it's been too long since the war to be a direct reaction to it, but the story, that is.
I don't think like Jeanne Dielman is a Auschwitz survivor in the movie. I'm saying I think like that context of Jeanne Dielman being a character that's based on Akerman's mother and Akerman's mother having been an Auschwitz survivor, I think that's maybe there subtextually, whether or not it's explicitly like meant to be a part of the story.
I think maybe in the way that her mother is just generally then kind of quiet and just kind of stuck within herself. She's not someone who communicates her emotions and her feelings outwards, and that's why she may struggle to connect with her son, because she, he's obviously kind of dreamy and losing himself in his books, but she's also not someone who seems like she's, she does a lot of work for him. She kind of serves him in that sense as a mother, but she's not really showing him her own personhood, or she's not really open to him in that sense, in that kind of more heartwarming way.
Yeah. There's definitely a mutual disconnect there, because at first I was like, this kid, he won't even talk to her or whatever. He's a wet noodle. There's one scene where he comes home from school and she's like peeling the potatoes that she scrambled to like go get to make dinner. And he like comes in the door and she's not there to meet him to take his coat like the other days that we've seen. And so he walks in past the closet into the kitchen where she's like working on dinner and just like hands her his coat and is like, here, take this. Anyway, so he's a little brat. But the additional context there is like there's also a couple moments where he kind of is like bearing his soul essentially and is like saying these things like, he's so afraid of sex that it made him want to die or something. I don't remember the exact. And she's just like, oh, go to sleep. Like, it's better not to think about that. Like, she does not engage at all with him in a meaningful way, which is like, coming from her own probably inability to deal with her trauma surrounding those things. But there's definitely a mutual disconnect there between them.
Yeah. I felt like the son was struggling with certain emotions that he tried to ask his mother about, but she just didn't have anything meaningful to say to him, basically. He brings up, I think, the discussion about love and sex also with her, and they talk about her father, how they met, and he's kind of looking for some romantic story. He's kind of looking for the meaning of love in a way, trying to place like the role that sex has within it, and how all that plays into a marriage. And she's answers with this very mechanical answer that we talked about earlier. Like
Yeah.
she basically just wanted a child, and her husband or his father was kind of ugly, but it's just a little detail. You'll just have to make do, and just nothing really of emotional substance coming from her that makes it logical that if he wasn't raised with that kind of warmth, then it's understandable that he doesn't have it as he grows older. And
Yeah.
he's there's kind of this this vicious cycle where she kind of becomes this almost dehumanized mother figure that only does the service things in house, and where and he starts because he views her as such, and she only gives him that. That kind of it reinforces each other in a way. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's definitely a very complicated relationship that they have, and I like that it says all that with so little interaction, and you still get the sense that there's just this weight of history that affects them both in a
Yeah.
way that it's just really intricately done. And
This is a movie I think you really have to read. Like, if you're watching this and your feeling is like there's nothing going on, I think this is one where this doesn't apply. There's some slow cinema where I get it. People are like, I'm not into it, whatever. There's nothing happening. Okay. I can kind of appreciate that disinterest in that. There's some movies that the intent there is really to kind of lead you on almost this meditation. A lot of what is going to be significant about it is kind of how you're mentally interacting with the images or the film or the pace or etc. But I think there is a lot going on here. If you're not getting that, it's one where you kind of have to give a little bit more by looking into and examining the details that would often not be necessary to pay attention to in another movie in order to understand what is happening. I think it's important to realize that the tiniest elements of this story were very specifically constructed. How she brushes her hair, exactly what she wears at specific times, the way in which things are done, the pace in which they're done, all of that there's behind the scenes footage of Akerman directing this on Criterion, which is very fascinating to watch. But she had a very specific vision for what is going on in this movie. And all of that stuff, if you pay attention to those details, all of those details are communicating things about the character to you as the audience. You just have to be willing to engage with those things. And I think if you do, it'll reward that because there's a lot there to be kind of explored. And there's a lot of mystery still left. And I think that's one of the reasons it's stuck with me is 90 minutes in, I started just getting this really nagging feeling of I want to know what she's thinking. I want to know what is going on in there. Are all these activities just keeping things at bay? Or, is she just keeping her hands busy while she thinks about the past? Is she wondering, what could have I done differently? How do I get out of this situation? Is she thinking why, or is she trying to go blank and go into this Zen state? And you can see even kind of the struggle potentially between those different emotional states kind of play out on some level. But ultimately, we don't get any resolve on that. We're just left with this question.
I think that in itself might already be a large part of the point that's being made, that behind, in the context of that period, that behind every mother figure that seems to be this servant figure, there is a actual life going on, and maybe you should wonder about what's going on inside of a person like that, even though this movie doesn't give you that much of a specific answer to it. But there's as you said, I think you said it at the beginning, like this, it's definitely a movie that makes you look differently at the caregiver figures that have been in your life. You know, traditionally that would usually be the mother, who was more of the home caretaker, whereas the father was often, or more traditionally speaking, out to work. Nowadays, that might have been shifted a little bit, but you know, there's still that sense that the idea that someone, in a way, I think it's a very interesting movie geared towards children and the way they look at their parents. But I guess you can apply it to any kind of service figure or someone who seems to occupy a place in society that's only meant to serve or function towards some other role or what is perceived to be something more important, and then kind of highlights that that is actually a human being too, and that
Right.
that kind of stuff that we always place on the periphery is also just as dramatic and an important aspect of life that just as much keeps this world turning. And yeah, in that sense, it's a movie that gave me a lot to think about and just challenged me in a way that makes me excited to watch it again. Not immediately, but maybe in a couple of years.
Yeah.
And yeah, I feel like it's definitely going to be a movie that is going to stick with me, and I can see why it's on the best of the one of the best 100 films ever made.
Yeah.
I wouldn't place it at one, but I definitely place it in there somewhere.
Yeah, it would be up there. It's going to be there for me. I'm very interested to revisit it and also to show it to people. I think watching this one with other people is an interesting experience.
Yeah.
It's a movie you can kind of, I think there's something to be said for just sitting with this movie and absorbing it. I read some people talking about theatrical experiences. You know, I think watching this with a group in a theater would be really interesting.
Oh yeah.
But it's also not a bad movie to like sit with somebody else if you're both engaging with it and kind of talk about while you're watching it, because it can invite this sort of engagement with the story in a way that I think is really interesting.
It gives enough quiet space in between.
Yeah, you're not talking over the action or whatever.
It's just a very interesting experience, or like an experiential movie too. One, you know, we've talked a lot about what it all means and what it signifies, and how everything is meticulously pointing towards some deeper meaning, or big, you know, everything is some small element that serves the story as a whole. But at the same time, it's also just, there's something to be said for the experience of it, which is kind of ineffable in a way to, you know, insofar as you want to articulate what that's like. Some have said like I don't really like people who say like, oh, the monotony of the boredom is the point. You're supposed to feel that way, because I felt like the monotony of the story, but I didn't feel the boredom necessarily. Like I felt more bored during Black Adam. So
Right.
And that the point of that movie is definitely not to have me bored. So if this movie actually does or is intended to bore me, like, then both movies have failed, because
right.
I should have been excited for the one and bored with the other.
Yeah.
But it was actually the other way around. But
I don't think the intention is here to bore you, and I didn't really feel bored, but I think there's a critical difference, even if boredom is creeping in this movie, the way it's framed. With something like Black Adam, if you're bored watching that, you're like bored at the movie.
Mm-hmm.
But watching this, when boredom starts to creep in, you're feeling bored sort of with the character, or there's whatever loneliness or the drudgery or those feelings in sync with your engagement and connection to the character. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's this weird paradoxical effect where when you start to feel those things, it's actually drawing you deeper into the experience of the movie, not disconnecting you from it. And it's not, you know, there could be a version of this movie, kind of, to be honest, what I expected, that's a little bit more like, is just a woman peeling potatoes for 10 minutes and then, you know, there's a couple days and then it ends. But it's actually, I think one of the very interesting things about it is that it's constructed with just enough. There's like a pinch of salt in there, in the sense that it, you know, the choice of casting was one thing Akerman talks about. Choosing like Delphine Seyrig was like a real movie star at the time. So if this movie was made now, it would be like watching Cate Blanchett in this role, or even Margot Robbie or something maybe. And there's an element of that where there is a murder at the end. There is, it's like, it's not detaching itself completely from the things that make the movies kind of salacious, or like why we become, there was a very intentional like juxtaposition of those things, which I think serves the movie as well.
I think casting a big star also meant to add weight to the actions that were going on, because it's one thing to show like a no-name actress portray this kind of sedentary life or just this kind of boring domestic lifestyle. But it's another thing to have like a huge star come in and have her use that star power to kind of elevate the what would otherwise be the invisible, or the unseen and the undervalued. Which I think we hadn't talked about that, but that's a great point to add.
Ultimately, it's worth giving a watch because there are certain stories that we traditionally kind of elevate within cinema, and often those are the stories that kind of on a cultural level or for a predominantly male audience feel like the big life and death dramatic stories, the epics or whatever. That's what gets the most attention. But the reality of living on this planet is that for every individual, their life is the life and death epic drama. There is no drama sort of more significant to you than the one that is playing out in your own life. And so why not point cinema towards sort of the intricacies of one of those smaller but and maybe less flashy, but no less cosmically significant dramas.
Yeah, in many ways, it's definitely a just as significant sacrifice that's made a Jeanne Dielman character, just in this everyday interactions, everyday service to others. That, I agree. That's definitely something that's generally undervalued compared to more grandeur and more great heroic sacrifices, or like momentary encapsulations of some great sacrifice, instead of this kind of prolonged effort to just keep the society going and keep a life going. And it's just it's a movie that really challenged me in a good way and gave me a lot to think about.
I'm glad it made the poll so that we had a good excuse to watch it and talk about it. It's a worthwhile movie to put on people's radar and have more attention given to.
Thank you all for listening. If you enjoy the show and want to help us keep it going, be sure to check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/cinemaofmeaning. Alternatively, you can follow us on our creator-owned streaming service Nebula. Cinema of Meaning is a Nebula original show, meaning that here you can experience our podcast ad-free, listen to all of our episodes a week early, and get instant access to all of our monthly bonus episodes. Last month, that was James Cameron's Avatar 2, The Way of Water. Before that, we've also covered the new All Quiet on the Western Front, Upstream Color, Alien Covenant, Drive, and many others. So you're really getting a whole new catalog of episodes. Right now, the best way to get access to Nebula is by signing up for CuriosityStream, which comes with a free Nebula subscription. To learn more, visit curiositystream.com/cinemaofmeaning, or just follow the link in the show notes. And we'll see you again next time.